disappeared. And what it was a phenomenal wake-up call for how quick what we think is normality and what we think is how things are. You can't change society that quickly. Well, you can. And you change it because of a simple sequence. And until we break this sequence, then freedom will always be in peril. It's the sequence of imposition and acquiescence. The few, I mean, if you look at the hierarchy of the world, the hierarchy of a country, it's a few people at the top of the pyramid dictating the direction, and at the bottom is the mass of the population that is the target of that direction. And between the two are endless levels of the hierarchy in which the higher level imposes and the lower level acquiesces to the imposition and then imposes it on the level below them. That's how hierarchies work. And if we, as a population, acquiesce to that level of the pyramid that's imposing on us, which is governments and government agencies and medical systems and World Health Organization, then we make a circuit between the few at the top and the mass of the population, in which the will of the few at the top is imposed on the mass of the population. When in purely mathematical terms, it is impossible for those few, I mean, the core of this cult, the global cult I talk about, you get them in a single room. It's impossible for those few to impose on that many. What makes it possible is imposition, acquiescence, imposition, acquiescence, imposition, acquiescence. And the acquiescence of the vast majority of the global population in 2020, 2021, was the reason all of that was possible. But what has been extremely encouraging is that, you know, I said a long time ago that there'll come a point, because I was trying to put this out, this is what they plan, this is what they plan, this is what they plan. And it's like, oh, yeah, of course you are, you're bloody mad, and all that stuff. And because it was happening, and if you knew what to look for, you could see it happening, you could see the sequence, but it wasn't, you know, obvious to the general population, because, you know, the general population just want to get on with their bloody lives. They don't want to face this. But there had to come a point where it broke the surface, where people could see it. Because if you are working towards creating a global dystopia based on AI, a digital concentration camp, there comes a point where that has to start manifesting. And at that point, more and more people can see it. And the more it moves on, the more and more and more people can see it. And thus, something else I said, this has got to get really bad before we turn it around. Because most people, they don't want to face it. Why would they? You know, I've spent 30 years, 40 years now, pushing against the door that doesn't want to open. Because who the hell wants to think this is what's going on? So when people come along and they say, oh, that's just a conspiracy theory, don't listen to that nutter, then that door starts to open. Because people, they don't want to believe it's real. But what has happened since COVID and what has followed on, which I'm sure we'll get into tomorrow, has focused the minds of more and more people. And I've gone from being laughed at, I mean, by every time I went in the street, I was laughed at. I knew if I turned around, I'd see people laughing and making faces at me. I was very rarely disappointed to being stopped in the street constantly, like you were showing there with yourself. stopped in the street constantly being asked to seriously talk about what the hell's going on and what we can do about it. And that is a confirmation of the scale of awakingness, not awakeness. We're all awakening, we're not awake. It's a big process, because I think we'll get into it tomorrow. This is much bigger than almost anyone realizes. But it's a confirmation of just how many people have started to get it as a result of COVID, because that was the point, and it had to be the point. Because if you're, like I say, if you're moving on, at some point you have to put yourself on public display, and then you stop trying to hide it, you start trying to sell it. We've reached the point where, with COVID, where that which was hidden entered the room. And what it did, it heard the door click behind it, right? Because we can see you now, and you ain't got anywhere to go. So, COVID was in one of the same period, an enormous challenge. It created enormous, and they just want to play it again, of course, in some other form. But it was an enormous challenge. It created enormous mental problems. It's killed enormous amounts of people, the jab alone. But it's also awakened so many people. You know, I just find it, people say to me, more people have got to wake up. Well, yeah, more the merrier. We need more and more people. But I tell you, if you were trying to get this stuff over in 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993, what's happening now is phenomenal. Because in those days, virtually no one wanted, there was no alternative media. People talk about the alternative media, there was no alternative media, it didn't exist. And now, the numbers that can see it, at least to some extent, is absolutely fantastic. And so we've got a base now that's vastly greater to build upon as they throw their next card.
Now we have that base, but also you called it, I think, the totalitarian tiptoe, when everyone's been conditioned to lockdowns, QR codes, jabs, that kind of thing. And so now, you know, in a heartbeat, oh, the lockdown thing, they can obey now immediately.
Yeah.
I walked around the street there at the end to show that, I mean, now nobody ever thinks that's gonna happen again. And most people back to their normal lives, so is that a problem?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, I've got this phrase I've used so over the years, know the outcome and you'll see the journey. If you don't know the outcome that's planned, then the daily events, whether it's COVID or whatever, are just random. They're just in and of themselves. They don't mean anything in terms of connections. They're just random events. But when you know what the outcome is planned to be, which is to create a global dystopia with a world unelected technocratic government dictating to every man, woman and child on the planet from a central point, when you realize that the idea is to connect the human brain to artificial intelligence, which can be controlled from a central point, and therefore humanity becomes a hive mind, centrally dictated via AI, where no longer are we have to be manipulated through control of information, even censorship, to impose and manipulate our opinions and our perceptions. Our perceptions will come direct from AI. AI will tell us what our perceptions are. So that's the outcome that's planned. That's where they've been going all this time. And now you start to see, you can see the stepping stones towards it. And, you know, but we are starting from a higher base. We are, Brian, in a different environment, in the sense of there are still vast numbers of people who are in a coma. It's a perceptual coma. And there's two types of people, two types of mentalities. that have been responsible for every tyranny in history, and they were responsible for the COVID tyranny. The first mentality just believes what they're told without question, and just does what they're told without question. The second group doesn't want to do it, but is terrified, frightened of the consequences of not doing it, so they do it anyway. Those two mentalities have created every tyranny in history, because fascism and communism, and it's never brought in by fascists and communists. Why? Because there's never enough of them. Fascism and communism tyranny is brought in by the population acquiescing